Bone and Sickle, bleeding saints and chorus witches.
It's done.
Hello, and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. We have a special episode for you today in which we have our usual reader for the episode, a storyteller in this case. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
So, Christmas is upon us, and as you might expect, we have our tree, a roaring fire, greens hung in the study and elsewhere, and I've made an 18th century punch.
The second of the season.
Yes, I tested another recipe the day we brought in the tree.
No disgusting egg whites?
Not in this one. Mrs. Carswell, who was missed in our Befana episode, is back in town after visiting her family.
Visiting my mother.
She had some time off, some much-needed rest and relaxation.
Mostly. Partly.
But you seem better. Rested. I'm happy to see it's not like October or November, not to get into anything unpleasant, keeping it light, spirit of the season and all.
Okay.
Well, and speaking of the season, I wanted to point out that listeners can now give the gift of Bone and Sickle to your friends, loved ones, or to yourself, of course. I'm talking about Patreon subscriptions. Any duration up to 12 months and any level can be gifted, though the bonus episode tier, I'd say, would be the biggest bang for your buck. That would be about 5 hours worth of extra episodes in a year.
It always helps the show.
Yes, the best part. So just go to patreon.com/boneandsickle, one word, spelled out, and add /gift at the end. Then you can make your selections.
Should we do the Patreon thank yous while we're on the topic?
Good idea, yes.
Thank you to our friends who listen to the show.
Sharing in our travels through tales of long ago.
Stories full of folklore.
Stories full of horror.
If you give us money, we will like you more.
And our heroes of the day are
Cloakrin, Spoopkin, Christina Dobrescu, Christian Beckestrup, Dave Baxter.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, and happy holidays.
Yes, and as you've been promised, we are tonight honoring a holiday tradition begun back in 2018 and honoring a custom beloved by the Victorians, that is, ghost stories for Christmas. This time around, we have 2 shorter stories, which will be read by Mrs. Carswell.
One's funny, and the other is very scary, I think.
That's right. Our first is from the 1891 collection, Told After Supper, by the British writer Jerome K. Jerome. He wrote novels, plays, essays, and nonfiction, but was best known for his comic writing, with a focus on the subgenre of comic travelogues.
And ghost stories.
Yes, of course. Told After Supper is an anthology of ghost stories told by acquaintances of our narrator's aunt and uncle, whose home provides the setting. Mrs. Carswell will be reading a story without a name, or actually, it appears before the story's proper, under the heading Introduction.
It was Christmas Eve. I begin this way because it is the proper, orthodox, respectable way to begin, and I have been brought up in a proper, orthodox, respectable way, and taught to always do the proper, orthodox, respectable thing. And the habit clings to me. Of course, as a mere matter of information, it is quite unnecessary to mention the date at all. the experienced reader knows it was Christmas Eve, without my telling him. It always is Christmas Eve in a ghost story. Christmas Eve is the ghosts' great gala night. On Christmas Eve, they hold their annual fete. On Christmas Eve, everybody in Ghostland who is anybody, or rather, speaking of ghosts, one should say, I suppose, every nobody who is any nobody, comes out to show himself or herself, to see and to be seen, to promenade about and display their winding sheets and grave clothes to each other, to criticize one another's style and sneer at one another's complexion. Christmas Eve parade, as I expect they themselves term it, is a function doubtless eagerly prepared for and looked forward to throughout Ghostland, especially the swagger set, such as the murdered barons, the crime-stained countesses, and the earls who came over with the conqueror and assassinated their relatives and died raving mad. Hollow moans and fiendish grins are, one may be sure, energetically practiced up. Blood-curdling shrieks and marrow-freezing gestures are probably rehearsed for weeks beforehand. Rusty chains and gory daggers are overhauled and put into good working order, and sheets and shrouds laid carefully by from the previous year's show are taken down and shaken out and mended and aired. Oh, it is a stirring night in Ghostland, the night of December the 24th. Ghosts never come out on Christmas night itself, you may have noticed. Christmas Eve, we suspect, has been too much for them, and they are not used to excitement. For about a week after Christmas Eve, the gentlemen ghosts, no doubt, feel as if they were all head and go about making solemn resolutions to themselves that they will stop in the next Christmas Eve, while lady spectres are contradictory and snappish and liable to burst into tears and leave the room hurriedly on being spoken to for no perceptible cause whatever. Ghosts with no position to maintain, mere middle-class ghosts, occasionally, I believe, do a little haunting on off nights on All Hallows Eve and Midsummer, and some will even run up for a mere local event to celebrate, for instance, the anniversary of the hanging of somebody's grandfather, or to prophesy misfortune. He does love prophesying a misfortune, does the average British ghost. Send him out to prognosticate trouble to somebody, and he is happy. Let him force his way into a peaceful home and turn the whole house upside down by foretelling a funeral, or predicting a bankruptcy, or hinting at a coming disgrace, or some other terrible disaster, about which nobody in their senses want to know sooner than they could possibly help, and the prior knowledge of which can serve no useful purpose whatsoever. And he feels that he is combining duty with pleasure. He would never forgive himself if anybody in his family had a trouble and he had not been there for a couple of months beforehand, doing silly tricks on the lawn or balancing himself on somebody's bed rail. Then there are, besides, the very young or very conscientious ghosts with a lost will or an undiscovered number weighing heavy on their minds, who will haunt steadily all the year round. And also the fussy ghost, who is indignant at having been buried in the dustbin or in the village pond, and who never gives the parish a single night's quiet until somebody has paid for a first-class funeral for him. But these are the exceptions. As I have said, the average Orthodox ghost does his one turn a year on Christmas Eve and is satisfied. Why, on Christmas Eve of all nights in the year, I could never myself understand. It is invariably one of the most dismal of nights to be out in, cold, muddy, and wet. And besides, at Christmas time, everybody has quite enough to put up with in the way of a houseful of living relations, without wanting the ghosts of any dead ones mooning about the place, I'm sure. There must be something ghostly in the air of Christmas. Something about the close, muggy atmosphere that draws up the ghosts, like the dampness of the summer rains brings out the frogs and the snails. And not only do the ghosts themselves always walk on Christmas Eve, but the live people always sit and talk about them on Christmas Eve. Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about specters. It is a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood. There is a good deal of similarity about our ghostly experiences, but this, of course, is not our fault, but the fault of ghosts, who never will try any new performances, but will always keep steadily to old, safe business. The consequence is that when you have been at one Christmas Eve party and heard 6 people relate their adventures with spirits, you do not require to hear any more ghost stories. To listen to any further ghost stories after that would be like sitting out 2 farcical comedies or taking in 2 comic journals. The repetition would become wearisome. There is always the young man who was 1 year spending the Christmas at a country house, and on Christmas Eve they put him to sleep in the west wing. Then, in the middle of the night, the room door quietly opens, and somebody, generally a lady in her nightdress, walks slowly in and comes and sits on the bed. The young man thinks it must be one of the visitors or some relative of the family, though he does not remember having previously seen her, who, unable to go to sleep and feeling lonesome all by herself, has come into his room for a chat. He has no idea it is a ghost. He is so unsuspicious. She does not speak, however, and when he looks again, she is gone. The young man relates the circumstance at the breakfast table next morning and asks each of the ladies present if it were she who was his visitor. But they all assure him that it was not, and the host, who has grown deadly pale, begs him to say no more about the matter, which strikes the young man as a singularly strange request. After breakfast, the host takes the young man into a corner and explains to him that what he saw was the ghost of a lady who had been murdered in that very bed, or who had murdered somebody else there. It doesn't really matter which. You can be a ghost by murdering somebody else, or by being murdered yourself, whichever you prefer. The murdered ghost is perhaps the more popular, but on the other hand, you can frighten people better if you are the murdered one, because then you can show your wounds and do groans. Then there is the skeptical guest. It is always the guest who gets let in for this sort of thing, by the by. A ghost never thinks much of his own family. It is the guest he likes to haunt, who, after listening to the host's ghost story on Christmas Eve, laughs at it and says that he does not believe there are such things as ghosts at all, and that he will sleep in the haunted chamber that very night if they will let him. Everybody urges him not to be reckless, but he persists in his foolhardiness and goes up to the yellow chamber, or whatever color the haunted room may be, with a light heart and a candle, and wishes them all good night, and shuts the door. Next morning, he has got snow-white hair. He does not tell anybody what he has seen. It is too awful. There is also the plucky guest who sees a ghost and knows it is a ghost and watches it, as it comes into the room and disappears through the wainscot, after which the ghost does not seem to be coming back, and there is nothing consequently to be gained by staying awake. He goes to sleep. He does not mention having seen the ghost to anybody for fear of frightening them. Some people are so nervous about ghosts, but determines to wait for the next night and see if the apparition appears again. It does appear again, and this time he gets out of bed, dresses himself and does his hair, and follows it, and then discovers a secret passage leading from the bedroom down into the beer cellar, a passage which no doubt was not unfrequently made use of in the bad old days of yore. After him comes the young man who woke up with a strange sensation in the middle of the night, and found his rich bachelor uncle standing by his bedside. The rich uncle smiled a weird sort of smile and vanished. The young man immediately got up and looked at his watch. It had stopped at 4:30, he having forgotten to wind it. He made inquiries the next day and found that, strangely enough, his rich uncle, whose only nephew he was, had married a widow with 11 children at exactly 11:45, only 2 days ago. The young man does not attempt to explain the circumstance. All he does is to vouch for the truth of his narrative. And to mention another case, there is a gentleman who is returning home late at night from a Freemason's dinner and who, noticing a light issuing from a ruined abbey, creeps up and looks through the keyhole. He sees the ghost of a grey sister kissing the ghost of a brown monk, and is so inexpressibly shocked and frightened that he faints on the spot, and is discovered there the next morning, lying in a heap against the door, still speechless and with his faithful latchkey clasped tightly in his hand. All of these things happen on Christmas Eve. They are all told of on Christmas Eve. For ghost stories to be told on any other evening than the evening of the 24th of December would be impossible in English society, as at present regulated. Therefore, in introducing the sad but authentic ghost stories that follow hereafter, I feel that it is unnecessary to inform the student of Anglo-Saxon literature that the date on which they were told and on which the incident took place was Christmas Eve. Nevertheless, I do so.
And so I'm back for a brief intro to our next story. It's also Victorian, by the Scottish writer and artist Hume Nisbet. His career as a painter wasn't particularly successful, but he did make a name for himself as a writer, one known primarily for two things. The first being travelogue writing, like Jerome K. and also novels with exotic locales. Many of these are set in the South Pacific and Australia, where Nisbet spent several years of his youth. The second genre, as you might have guessed, is ghost stories, published in a variety of collections. In 1894, there was The Haunted Station, 1899, Paths of the Dead, and 1900, the stories Weird and Wonderful. There was also a collection called Mistletoe Manor in 1902, which includes supernatural tales and presumably some with a connection to Christmas. Our entry tonight comes from Stories Weird and Wonderful, and this would be a good time to turn off the lights and refill the glass, not in that order, though, fill, then extinguish, and then sit back and enjoy The Old Portrait.
Old-fashioned frames are a hobby of mine. I am always on the prowl amongst the framers and dealers and curiosities for something quaint and unique in picture frames. I don't care much for what is inside them, for being a painter it is my fancy to get the frames first and then paint a picture which I think suits their probable history and design. In this way I get some curious and I think also some original designs. One day in December, about a week before Christmas, I picked up a fine but dilapidated specimen of wood carving on a shop near Soho. The gilding had been worn nearly away, and 3 of the corners broken off. Yet, as there was one of the corners still left, I hoped to be able to repair the others from it. As for the canvas inside this frame, it was so smothered with dirt and time stains that I could only distinguish it had been a very badly painted likeness of some sort of commonplace person, daubed in by a poor pot-boiling painter, to fill the second-hand frame which his patron may have picked up cheaply, as I had done after him. But as the frame was all right, I took the spoiled canvas along with it, thinking it might come in handy. For the next few days my hands were full of work, of one kind and another, so that it was only on Christmas Eve that I found myself at the liberty to examine my purchase, which had been lying with its face to the wall since I had brought it into my studio. Having nothing to do on this night and not in the mood to go out, I got my picture and frame from the corner, and laying them upon the table with a sponge, basin of water, and some soap, I began to wash so that I might see them better. They were in a terrible mess, and I think I used the best part of a packet of soap powder, and I had to change the water about 12 times before the pattern began to show up on the frame, and the portrait within it asserted its awful crudeness, vile drawing, and intense vulgarity. It was the bloated, piggish visage of a publican, clearly, with a plentiful supply of jewelry displayed, as is usual with such masterpieces, where the features are not considered of so much importance as a strict fidelity in the depicting of such articles as watchguard and seals, finger rings and breastpins. These were all there, as natural and hard as reality. The frame delighted me, and the picture satisfied me that I had not cheated the dealer with my price. And I was looking at the monstrosity as the gaslight beat full upon it, and wondering how the owner could be pleased with himself as thus depicted, when something about the background attracted my attention. A slight marking underneath the thin coating, as if the portrait had been painted over by some other subject. It was not much, certainly, yet enough to make me rush over to my cupboard, where I kept my spirits of wine and turpentine, with which, and a plentiful supply of rags, I began to demolish the publican ruthlessly, in the vague hope that I might find something worth looking at underneath. A slow process that was, as well as a delicate one, so that it was close upon midnight before the gold cable rings and vermilion visage disappeared, and another picture loomed up before me. Then, giving it the final washover, I wiped it dry and set it in a good light on my easel, while I filled and lit my pipe, and then sat down to look at it. What had I liberated from that vile prison of crude paint? For I did not require to set it up to know that this bungler of the brush had covered and defiled a work as far beyond his comprehension as the clouds are from the caterpillar. The bust and head of a young woman of uncertain age merged within a gloom of rich accessories, painted as only a master hand can paint, who is above asserting his knowledge and who has learned to cover his technique. It was as perfect and natural in its somber yet quiet dignity, as if it had come from the brush of Moroni. A face and neck perfectly colorless in their pallid whiteness, with the shadows so artfully managed that they could not be seen, and for this quality would have delighted the strong-minded Queen Bess. At first, as I looked, I saw in the center of a vague darkness a dim patch of gray gloom that drifted into the shadow. Then the grayness appeared to grow lighter as I sat from it and leaned back in my chair until the features stole out softly and became clear and definite, while the figure stood out from the background as if tangible, although, having washed it, I knew that it had been smoothly painted. An intent face, with delicate nose, well-shaped although bloodless lips, and eyes like dark caverns without a spark of light in them. The hair loosely around the head, and oval cheeks, massive, silky textured jet black and lusterless, which hid the upper portion of her brow, with the ears and fell in straight, indefinite waves over the left breast, leaving the right portion of the transparent neck exposed. The dress and background were symphonies of ebony, yet full of subtle coloring and masterly feeling. A dress of rich brocaded velvet with a background that represented vast receding space, wondrously suggestive and awe-inspiring. I noticed that the pallid lips were parted slightly and showed a glimpse of the upper front teeth, which added to the intent expression of the face. A short upper lip which curled upward, with the underlip full and sensuous, or rather, if color had been in it, would have been so. It was an eerie-looking face that I had resurrected on this midnight hour of Christmas Eve. In its passive pallidity, it looked as if the blood had been drained from the body, and that I was gazing upon an open-eyed corpse. The frame, also, I noticed for the first time, in its details appeared to have been designed with the intention of carrying out the idea of life in death. What had before looked like scrollwork of flowers and fruit were loathsome snake-like worms twined amongst the charnel house bones, which they half-covered in a decorative fashion. A hideous design in spite of its exquisite workmanship that made me shudder and wish that I had left the cleaning to be done by daylight. I am not at all of a nervous temperament, and would have laughed had anyone told me that I was afraid. And yet, as I sat here alone with that portrait opposite to me, in this solitary studio away from all human contact, for none of the other studios were tenanted on this night, and the janitor had gone on his holiday, I wished that I had spent my evening in a more congenial manner. For in spite of a good fire on the stove and the brilliant gas, that intent face and those haunting eyes were exercising a strange influence upon me. I heard the clocks from the different steeples chime out the last hour of the day, one after the other, like echoes taking up the refrain and dying away in the distance. And still, I sat spellbound, looking at that weird picture with my neglected pipe in my hand and a strange lassitude creeping over me. It was the eyes which fixed me now with the unfathomable depths of an absorbing intensity. They gave out no light, but seemed to draw my soul into them, and with it my life and strength, as I lay inert before them, until, overpowered, I lost consciousness and dreamt. I thought that the frame was still on the easel with the canvas, but the woman had stepped from them and was approaching me with a floating motion, leaving behind her a vault filled with coffins, some of them shut down whilst others lay or stood upright and open, showing the grisly contents in their decaying and stained shrouds. I could only see her head and shoulders with the somber drapery of the upper portion and the inky wealth of hair hanging round. She was with me now, that pallid face touching my face, and those cold, bloodless lips glued to mine with a close, lingering kiss, while the soft black hair covered me like a cloud and thrilled me through and through with a delicious thrill that, whilst it made me grow faint, intoxicated me with delight. As I breathed, she seemed to absorb it quickly into herself, giving me back nothing, getting stronger as I was becoming weaker, while the warmth of my contact passed into her and made her palpitate with vitality. And all at once the horror of approaching death seized upon me, and with a frantic effort I flung her from me and started up from my chair, dazed for a moment and uncertain where I was. Then consciousness returned, and I looked round wildly. The gas was still blazing brightly, while the fire burned ruddy in the stove. By the timepiece on the mantel I could see that it was 12:30. The picture and frame were still on the easel, only as I looked at them, the portrait had changed. A hectic flush was on the cheeks, while the eyes glittered with life, and the sensuous lips were red and ripe-looking, with a drop of blood still upon the nether one. In a frenzy of horror, I seized my scraping knife and slashed out the vampire picture. Then, tearing the mutilated fragments out, I crammed them into my stove and watched them frizzle with savage delight. I have that frame still, but I have not yet had the courage to paint a suitable subject for it.